Hi, and welcome to Academics of PA. This is Bruce McDonald, and with me this week I have Kendra Stewart, who is a professor and the director of the Joseph P. Riley Center for
Livable
professor and director of the Joseph P. Riley Center for Livable Communities at the College of Charleston. Might take me a time or two, but I'll eventually get there.
I know, it's tough. It's a mouthful.
Kendra's also the past president of the American Society for Public Administration. So, Kendra, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I wanted to start by asking you kind of about your entry into academia, why you chose to have an academic career, and then why you chose public administration in particular.
Sure. Well, I really kind of just fell into it, and then I fell in love with it. I went to graduate school at the University of South Carolina to get a master's in political science because I thought I wanted to work in the news industry in radio or television broadcasting. And that was my undergraduate area of focus. And I interned in that. And I was recommended by one of my mentors in that area that getting a master's in political science would help that. But when I started classes, they just didn't really resonate with me. And I was very disappointed in what I thought was the lack of applicability of what I was learning. It seemed very, esoteric or theoretical, and not to criticize the field of political science because I do have a PhD in that, but it wasn't a really great fit. And I was really struggled my first semester in trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And then I met a friend of a friend who was getting her MPA at the University of South Carolina and said, "Oh, you should look at the MPA program." And so I went and met with the director and was like, "This is what I'm looking for." And so the next semester I started taking MPA classes, and it was a fit. And I was like, this is exactly what I wanted to learn. And so when I finished, my internship turned into a full-time job, and I was working in state government. And I thought I wanted to work in federal government, but my boss, who was also a mentor and a pracademic, who had been both a professor of political science, PA, and was running a large state agency in South Carolina, convinced me, one, that I would be more suited in state or local government because I like working directly with folks. And then he also convinced me that I should get my PhD while I was working there. And when I said, "Why would I do that?" And he said, "Well, because it's free," because I was fortunate to work at the state at a time when they did tuition reimbursement. So I went into getting my PhD because he suggested it, because it fit into my schedule and someone else was willing to pay for it. And, I never really thought, I loved the practice of public administration. I really liked working in state government. And that's where I somewhat saw myself spending my career in either state or local government, or maybe eventually even federal government or nonprofit. But he kept telling me I would be wasting my PhD if I didn't go into academia, at least at some point. And so, which again wasn't really of great interest to me, I didn't think, until one time he was teaching a class and went out of town and had me teach his graduate class. And I just fell in love with teaching. And I didn't really expect that. It was so much fun and the engagement with young people. And so I then did start looking a little more at the academic track of our field, and ended up actually kind of finding my first job at Eastern Kentucky University in that same way, where I thought maybe I'll try for an academic job. And, I wasn't really sure I was going to do that, but it just happened to work out and be a great fit. And I've loved it ever since. I really love that marriage of practice and theory that we have in our field.
There's three things that I'm struggling with to ask you about, because there's three things that I want to harp onto out of that. The first is, I didn't actually realize your undergraduate was in journalism, but I love that it is. There's a number of us in the field who in the last few months I've discovered we are all recovering journalist wannabes, I guess might be a nice way of putting it. But it's interesting that you do have this kind of random cluster of people who have come into public administration with a journalism interest, and I don't know why that is.
I think part of it is, maybe back when some of us came up, being in journalism was really like public service. There were these great journalists who were really providing a public service, right? Like Walter Cronkite or all of these people who we saw as providing information that the public didn't get otherwise. And I just think that over the last, I would say, since the 24-hour news cycle or, the internet, that journalism has really become something that's more akin to entertainment. Or maybe too, part of it is, I don't know about you, but I worked at a TV station for about a year. Interning, and I'll never forget the day that everybody got I worked during the night, like during the 11 o'clock news, and the evening that everybody got so excited because the Humane Society was burning down. And I was like, "Oh, I don't know that I wanna be in a field that is always excited." Like, crisis is good news, and it was, like, they were all very nice people, and they weren't excited that animals were dying, and I got it because it had been such a slow news week in the middle of summer for or news month, I think, and so I think that probably happens to a lot of us. I don't know that then that a part of us that really liked the idea of service in journalism, providing people with information or helping people understand what's going on or looking into things when there's corruption, that we just transferred over to another area of service. But I don't know. There's also so much overlap too, don't you think?
There is. I mean, just the nature of how you communicate with people from that journalism background really translates into what we have to do on the public administration side, because so much of what people know and understand about government is functionally wrong.
Right. Yeah, and maybe that's part of it too. Maybe it's the education that we went just straight to the heart of the problem, right? And trying to educate them directly rather than be the journalists who are trying to educate folks, relying on learning the information and then translating it into a simple way. Now we get to educate people in the classroom where they have to be their captive audience, right? It is interesting though, you're right. I don't know, I'm not trying to plug a book, but we have a book about to come out on the practice of government public administration. And a lot of us who have been involved in it are in that same boat. We were people who had worked in or still work to some degree in either, the one side or the other. There's also a lot of transition from like, so my first job in state government was working with the press, speaking to the press. And part of that was they hired me to do that because of my journalism background and training and thinking I'd have some insight on that. I'm not sure I did, but I was willing to act like I did for a while. But I will say, transitioning from that to being an academic, where talking to the press, you get to say whatever you want and you have a little bit of protection compared to the days where I had to always toe the party line and worry that whatever was printed was going to have a backlash on my job. It's a really different and refreshing way to deal with the media than the other two ways, than having worked under there and then having to work and directly, serve as a spokesperson, to now getting to give an academic perspective on something is definitely a lot more fun. Don't you think, Bruce?
I enjoyed what I did. I'll say I interned with the newspaper briefly in college, but I was graduating right at the time when newspapers were dying. So jobs in the press at the time were few and far between. And it was take a job in Alaska or do something else. So I went and did something else and ended up working for a senator, which was night and day different, I thought at the beginning, but it really was about telling the story to the constituents of here's what's going on. So there is this kind of nice overlap.
Yeah.
But, as you say, as an academic, I can get up and kind of say what I actually think and what I believe instead of toting whatever it is that the senator needs to have put
Right.
forward at the time. And that's kind of nice. On the other hand, it's also nice to have somebody else tell you what to talk about sometimes.
That's true.
Whenever I have to open my own mouth, I usually stick my foot in there a little too much.
I don't know, Bruce. I think you've said a lot of smart things. So
Well, you're only saying that because I haven't edited the episode yet. So we'll see once I get that finished if you still agree.
I'm sure I will. I have no doubt.
So you mentioned the book. Can you tell me a little bit about the book?
Sure, and actually, this is the second edition of the book, and I hadn't even thought about bringing it up, but I only did because you mentioned, your point was very well resonated with me, because that's how this book came about. It's actually part of the ASPA book series, and this is an updated edition. I guess the first one we did, I can't remember, isn't that terrible, in 2010 or 11 maybe? And Mordecai Lee, who is sort of the big name in the field for government communications or public relations or whatever you want to call it, was he's the leading editor, and of course the guy who's been doing this for a long time. And then Grant Neeley and I had always connected over this, because he does, and he now serves as, he's in the Navy Guard, and he does, or the reserves, I'm sorry, he's in the Navy Reserves, and one of his big job is as a spokesperson wherever they are. And so he and I had always, chat about this experience, and we talked about how very often in government, the way it generally works in local and state government is someone just gets tossed into that position. It's nothing that the government generally strategizes over and says, oh, we need to hire somebody who has a specific degree to talk to the media and to develop a press strategy or a communication strategy. It's something that generally we'd hear back from MPA students who graduated, and they're like, oh, I now have to do the social media, or I have to, there's an issue and they want me to talk to the press about it. What should I do? And so we wrote this book, or we edited this book and got a lot of really great people who are both practitioners and academics to make it a very practical type of book, so that someone who was going into the field somebody who worked for government, local or state government really, and nonprofit now as well, could use this as somewhat of a guide to developing their public communication. So it's got chapters on things from, developing a strategy to designing a public information campaign and assessing that, to evaluation, to then a lot now, of course, on digital media and social media and policies you should have and things you need to think about and how you put yourself out there and so forth. So it was really a fun book to edit, because I learned an awful lot. And what's exciting right now is what I learned too in our field is we have a lot of younger new people coming into this area. And I know you're familiar with a lot of these folks who are writing on things that we called a decade ago e-government. And, that really is about how the government communicates with the public through multiple strategies or lenses and all of the challenges that come with that. And I guess I should say the book will be out in just a few months from what I've been told. So we just did the final review of the manuscript. So
What was the name of it, really quick?
It's The Practice of Government Public Relations.
Perfect. I'm actually writing that down, is why I asked.
Thank you. I mean, Stacy Z has written a chapter, and I'm trying to think. I know there's lots of people who have chapters in there, particularly a lot of younger folks like Arun. I'm sure you know Arun,
Oh, yeah.
Kayla Schwerer, folks like that all have chapters in there. So
cool. I actually look forward to reading it.
Oh, good.
Which most academic books I really don't say that about.
I know. Same.
I still stand by that the only person who's ever read my dissertation is my mom.
Oh, that's pretty impressive. She did. My mom even admitted she did not. So
my mom made adamant that she read every word, though she added the clause that she didn't understand most of them, but she read the word.
She read it. That is so sweet, Bruce. I love that.
No, my mom, she's a sweetheart. I was about to say she's pretty cool, but cool, maybe not so much, but she's a sweetheart.
You could say she definitely loves her son, because that's a task no one should have to ever do, right? I don't mean that about your dissertation. I mean that about anyone's dissertation that they don't understand, right?
Oh, yeah. No, I got to my defense, and two of the members were like, I didn't read it. And I was
really?
Like,
that's works to your advantage, I guess. I'm pretty sure not everybody read mine. I was 8 months pregnant when I defended my dissertation, and I was like, my doctor said not to upset me because I could go into labor. And so that was the nicest dissertation defense, I'm pretty sure, ever.
It was bad enough writing a dissertation. I can't imagine grad school or working on a dissertation while pregnant as well.
Oh, well, it was certainly a very good motivation for finishing it.
I bet. Yeah. So I'm guessing that they passed you and you didn't have the baby at the defense, which is always a good thing.
Exactly. It went very smoothly. And then literally the next day I got on a plane and went to interview at EKU. So it was kind of a crazy time.
Well, I mean, there you have. They can't really tell you no because that's just mean for them too.
I know. It's another good trick. Show up on a job interview very pregnant.
Next time I'm looking, I'll try that.
Yeah, try that, Bruce. Let me know how that works out.
Probably definitely not in my favor.
Oh.
So, given the practitioner background, given the PhD experience that you had, is there anything that you learned from that experience that you kind of wish you knew earlier? Any advice that you would give to a PhD student who's kind of looking to make a similar transition or start a family during grad school? All of which are things that kind of get harped on as being something you shouldn't really do, but I think that's an unfair harping for people to do at the same time.
Yeah, I think there are several things that I walked away with is, don't let people tell you what you can't do, because I did get a lot of that. One of the things I remember being told was that I couldn't work full time and get my PhD, which they didn't know I was going to do when they admitted me to the program. And I'm not sure they would have admitted me if they'd realized I didn't deceive them intentionally. They had just assumed I was going to quit my job to do it full time, but I did not. And I did, work full time and finish my PhD. And in fact, I did it in a less amount of time than some other folks who were my peers who were on the more traditional track. And the other thing they, told me is I couldn't write my dissertation in a year, which I did that while I was also teaching. I was picked up some classes to teach as well. And so, oftentimes we all get into trying to advise our students or here at the end, and people saying, you got to tell them they can't do that. And I'm like, well, we can always give them advice as to, well, maybe you need to narrow a scope or something, or maybe you need to have a backup timeline. But to think that we all work it the same ways, or, that's just wrong. And, I had two kids before I went up for tenure, and a lot of people advised against that as well. But, I just had a different kind of work schedule than a lot of people. And so I think, doing what is realistic, and that's not always realistic for everyone. I had good support to be able to do some of that. The other thing that I really walked away with was, I always try to tell folks, particularly in PhD programs, is don't get sucked into the academic drama or bullshit that is so easy to get sucked into. We have in departments, particularly I feel like in doctoral programs, there's a tendency that your world gets really small. And, and I think I was successfully able to avoid a lot of that because I worked full time, but I watched it happen all around me and how damaging it was for some of my fellow students who were sometimes bullied into by faculty, in a university where there were, in a department, I should say, not a university, where there were sometimes some particularly not very nice people in a department. And so they would, bully students into doing research for them, or things like that. And they really felt like they didn't have that option or that choice, and so trying to associate yourself with people who are looking out for your best interests. And that sometimes can be hard to do because in departments, sometimes those people aren't often the ones who seem to have the most power because they've been nice, right? And they haven't
Right.
bullied other people around. But at the end of the day, it was funny because there were people who tried to pressure me to put some people on my committee who I did not want on my committee because I had watched offenses where they weren't very nice to students. And I kept getting told, oh, you'll never get a job, or people, this name is in our department and you should include them. And, I just didn't do it. I stuck with the people who I liked and who I felt like would support me. And as I already mentioned, I finished before some of those other people who put more, quote, prestigious people on their committees because they gave students a really hard time. And the truth is, I know we always say this, but the only good dissertation is a done dissertation. And that I mean, sometimes people do, yeah, you can usually get some publications out of your dissertation, but don't let faculty suck you into believing that you have to write your life's work while you need to finish. And you need to have people, you need to surround yourself with people who support that, even if it doesn't seem like the right decision. Because eventually all the, everything, all the cards land where they should, and one of those people who they tried to force me to have on my committee has since been forced out of our field for serious sexual harassment. And, and I was like, look back now and think I didn't really know that that's what I was doing, but I was looking out for my own self-interest. And it was easier for me to do, again, as someone who had a different job. But everyone I know who then steps away from that looks back and thinks, oh, that was a lot more bullshit while I was in it than it really needed to be. And, walking away from that is a really tough thing. And the other thing I should say is go after jobs that fit you. Don't cave to pressures again, sometimes of your department of faculty of, getting a job that they want you to have or that they think is more prestigious. And, I don't, when I finished, I watched so much weird political drama going on in my department that I was like, I do not want to work in a department like this. And so I really avoided Research One universities when I went on the market. And maybe that's not fair, but I also, again, was finishing from a political science department with a PhD in political science. And so most of the programs even though I was looking at PA, it was a little bit different. But and maybe it's probably not fair to Research Ones, and it isn't anymore, but it was my limited experience. But I also knew I really loved teaching. And so when I applied, I went after the job at Eastern Kentucky University. I didn't my department didn't see that as very prestigious or important, but it was such a great job. I loved it. It was a department that was supportive. It was a university that gave me tremendous opportunities. And, and that's really what matters, is going somewhere that's going to nurture you and support you and let you be who you are. And I just had tremendous job satisfaction while I was there. And the whole time I was there, I had really good other opportunities as well. And really the only reason I left is coming to the College of Charleston. When I was offered the job, the president of EKU called me and was like, "What can we do to get you to stay?" And I was like, "Well, can you make it warm in the winter and be by the ocean?" And he was like, "Good luck. We'll really miss you." And I was like, I'm a Florida girl with who likes the water and the warm weather. So that was why I left. And I would say the exact same thing about the College of Charleston. Is I'm in a department of people who all really care about the same thing, and that's our students. And that's what I care about too. And I'm not saying that's better than other jobs, but I love teaching. I love working with students. I love public service. I like writing and research, but it's secondary to some degree for me compared to those other things. And so I am drawn to departments that also value that. And I think it's so important that, and I've seen so many friends who've kind of struggled with that. And eventually, though, they're happy when they find the place that matches what they care about.
I'm thinking about my experience when I went to South Bend. I went as a visiting for my first year. I had the same thing as you when they offered me the tenure track. I was like, but it's cold. I'm from Florida. The day they offered me the tenure track, we had 3 feet of snow in about 2 hours.
Oh my gosh.
If I could have gotten my car out and driven back to Tallahassee, I would have in a heartbeat.
Yeah. It's particularly, I went for my CFC interview in February where I left EKU where it was like 30 and slushy to Charleston where it happened to be 60 and sunny. And I was like, oh yeah, if you ask me, I'll be here.
There's definitely kind of a trade-off between going between a more teaching-oriented institution and a research institution in different kind of ways. But
completely,
that trade-off goes both directions. I mean, this is not that I don't like my colleagues now, but my colleagues in South Bend, almost all of us had lunch or coffee together every week.
Yeah.
We knew everybody. We knew everybody's family. We knew exactly where everybody lived, everybody's birthdays. It was a small but really fun group, and your relationship with students is massively different.
Yeah.
I have great students now, but my students in South Bend still message me on Facebook quite frequently. It's great.
I know it is really a neat experience. And, and again, that's not, I think you and I are similar in what we like, and that really feeds us, but if you're someone who really just loves research and likes, there is no criticism in that whatsoever. I think it's fabulous. And I admire that. That I've had a few colleagues like that come to the College of Charleston, and they realize it's not researchy enough for them, and they're not as happy because they don't want that kind of relationship with a student. And they don't really want to spend so much time in a classroom or knowing their colleagues. And so, they generally end up leaving. And again, that is nothing bad. It's just more about learning who you are and figuring that out and where you would be the best fit. And yeah, I was lucky to learn that earlier, to realize that I like being somewhere that values practice and academics, and that values teaching and service, and research. I mean, we have a strong research component at the College of Charleston, but it's not R1 level whatsoever. So
Yeah, I think that's an important lesson to learn. I mean, if most people in grad school, we hear, here's what's expected. You're going to go get that R1 job. You're going to publish 2 to 3 a year. You're going to do all these very particular things. And if you don't hit that, or that's not what you want, you're almost kind of looked down upon
yeah.
in a lot of ways. Or even if you're not looked down upon, you feel like you're being looked down upon.
Yeah. And some department, I mean, in the department I was in, you definitely were. There was a really good person who was in the class ahead of me who got offered a great job in the middle of nowhere at an R1, and a good job that was in a really cool city, but it was like a regional R1 type of deal, and our department, the faculty were furious, but his wife was like, I don't want to live. I don't want to insult him. I said, I don't want to live in the middle of the great, and it was a cold area, and he was coming from the South as well. And, and the other job was in a more Southern, really cool, hip city. And his wife had she was in a professional field and needed to be able to get a job too. And so he took that job. And I mean, faculty actually disparaged him in front of students in class. And I was so appalled and couldn't believe it, because I was like, why is this their business? That, he did turn down a really, what maybe is an academically prestigious job, but he cared more about the quality of his life. And that's really important. And I think that sometimes you can lose sight of that. And again, someone else would maybe love a job. I know people who hate the heat and love the cold. And I think, oh my goodness, I don't
What's wrong
understand
with
it, but
you?
I get it. And they would never want a job in Charleston, South Carolina, because they can't stand the heat. But, and it's just about always keeping that in mind, I think.
I think that's been one of the interesting things of the podcast over the past couple of years is we have these large assumptions about who people are and how they got there. And I think we have almost institutionalized a lot of those assumptions, and then talking to some of these people and finding out their paths are quite different than what everybody actually assumed that they are.
Yeah, that's interesting, I bet.
One of the things I did want to do is ask you kind of about your perspective of the field, some of the challenges that we as public administration have. You've had a interesting experience both from the academic and the practitioner, but as well as the engagement with the field that you've had over the past few years. It's kind of interested to see as to where you saw us going or what we should be doing.
Sure. Well, I guess first I'll talk a little bit about the academic field, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the practical field of public administration. And I could only really say or use this analogy to other PA people. But if you think about academic disciplines like organizations, I think about PA as coming to that point of maturity, the whole downs, the life cycles of organization, that I feel
Yeah.
like even not very, I mean, we all always talk about how we're a new field, a young field. And, when you teach certain, when I used to teach organizations, you have to explain like, gee, none of the real base literature comes from PA because we weren't even a field, right? We rely on sociologists and management and psychology. And, I think it's taken, and even when I was in graduate school, or getting my first jobs, most people had PhDs in political science or policy and did PA, and people had DPAs, which now have been transitioned to PA. But now there's like so many young, great people coming out into the field with PhDs in public administration. And I think we're, finally getting to a point where we figured out who we are to some degree. And again, I'm not saying any of that is negative about political scientists, as I am one of those who have PA specializations. But now with the proliferation of so many good journals and so much now real PA research, we have become a much more mature field than even just where we were 20 years ago. I think, and it's now something like I mentioned when I got an MPA, I'd never even heard of an MPA, and that wasn't something people talked about in political science. And now all the time, I see my political science or other colleagues on campus send students my way to talk about an MPA because people now know what an MPA is, compared to 20 years ago, where it was not really. It was just a little bit of an unknown field and maybe wasn't as academically respected as some other fields in social science. And I think part of that is probably because our challenge is sometimes having an academic identity. And I mean that in the sense of, you can look at where PA programs are located in variety of institutions, and it's all across the board, right? Rather than some of our more traditional programs like English or biology, which have real strong homes. Public administration can end up in social science schools, it can end up in business schools. We are finally at a point where, particularly the largest and larger institutions like yours have schools that are just focused on public affairs or but something in which PA plays an important role. But we're, I think, just getting to that point. I think we've also seen international proliferation of public administration, which was not the case again just 20 years ago, that now it's a legitimate academic field and, all over the world. And even if you just look at the ASPA conference this year, where we had over 60 different countries represented, which was a record, or even the Founders Fellows from this year, and the international representation we saw amongst them, that really highlights this fact that we are now an international discipline, which I think has really just come about. And so I think the challenge is thinking about how we keep from hitting that point in organizational life cycles of where we're fighting for survival. And I think we've seen that in some other academic disciplines. How do we remain relevant and determine who we are at the same time? Which is probably a little easier for PA because we are such an applied field. And that certainly has been the interest of younger people today, is wanting to do something that's applicable. And so I think we have that advantage, but how do we remain relevant in the academy? And then from the practical side, I think COVID this year was, of course, really a great challenge everywhere. But the positive aspect is that it showed how essential public service is. And I think has really led to a revaluation of people working in government, that suddenly people were paying attention to experts again. The American Recovery Plan is going to infuse our state and local, tribal, and regional governments with money to address some of our really big problems. So we'll really see capacity being built in a lot of our governments. But at the same time, we're going to have a lot of people watching us and, demanding accountability, and that we can really expect criticism on how this money is spent. And we have to be ready to spend a lot of money really fast in ways that will impact our communities and that we can prove have made a difference, which is really a tremendous challenge, but I do think we're up for it. I think we're also beginning to see greater reliance on public-private partnerships. I know just in the region I work in this past year, we spent a lot of time working with businesses who were trying to look for government for guidance and what to do, and whether that was economic recovery or health standards or, all of these safety things that came around COVID. That business was really willing to take a back seat and say, tell us what to do and help us, which is a real different attitude than we'd seen in recent years. I'd also say one of the really great things about this past year coming out of tragedy is the broader scale interest in social equity and a real acknowledgement that problems are both systemic and structural, which is just something we used to talk about in the academy, but that a lot of people didn't really, I think, believe or see firsthand until, again, I don't want to demean at all the real tragedy that has happened to so many people, particularly African American people, over the past year. But if there's one good thing that's come out of it, it's just this, broader recognition and acceptance that this is a problem. And it also means that there's a recognition that government needs to be deeply involved in the changing of this, as we acknowledge that these problems are systemic and structural. And that I think we're seeing a real move from just government being concerned with representation and engagement to trying to develop really more authentic engagement, including diverse perspectives, not just in their opinions about what government is doing, but in actual decision making, and real people really looking for accountability and power structures that include people with diverse backgrounds and perspectives. And I think all of that is really positive. I would also say intergovernmental relations have changed a lot over this past year, and they're maybe focusing more on collaboration and knowledge sharing rather than just fund exchanging. And I know we saw that in our state and lots of other states, where local governments having to work with the states in administering vaccines or mask ordinances or whatever, and then still connecting with, the CDC being reliant on those as well. So just a whole different type of federalism that's more than about just exchanging money. And then last, I want to say that really, in order to solve these big problems that we are now facing, like sea level rise or climate change or systemic racism or, pandemics, that we need a new way of thinking. And one of the greatest challenges we face is keeping these real issues and challenges from becoming political. And that's been really a huge problem over this past year. And how can we make science and public health, um, how can we make them more technical issues or scientific or policy issues like they really are, rather than political issues? And how can we come together to address them rather than just allowing them to become fodder for political debate? So to me, those are the real where our field is going and what are some of the challenges that we're facing.
That's a great list, and mine's going in 5 directions.
Just 5? I know your mind is usually in 100 different directions, or you always have a lot of balls in the air and thoughts in your head. So
It is. It never stops. I try, but it never really stops.
well,
So
one of the things I really like about you. So
it's one of the things that usually gets me into trouble.
yeah, it can have that effect as well.
Which is probably why we get along.
Right.
So, one of the things I like about public administration is that politics administration dichotomy of trying to keep politics out of what we do, because we have to be able to work with people from both parties to accomplish whatever it is that government needs to do.
But yet still balance that idea of that we live in a democratic republic, and that our job is to represent the will of the people. But yet, how do we balance that, with these other greater issues, right?
Oh, yeah. I do a lot of work with local governments throughout North Carolina, and about half of them think I'm a Democrat, half think I'm a Republican.
That means you're
And
doing
I was
something
at
right.
a meeting that had people from both sides, and they couldn't figure out who I was.
I think that's always a good thing, right?
Oh, yeah. It's intentional.
Right.
The only way you can work with both sides is if nobody really thinks that you're aligned with one.
Well, I mean, it's just crazy the things that have become political that really shouldn't be over
Oh,
the past
absolutely.
few years, and I don't say that coming from one side or the other, just, but anyways, before I get in trouble for saying anything offensive, let's move on to something else.
Well, I always point to when I worked on the Hill, is when West Wing was on.
Oh,
There's an episode where they're talking about Thanksgiving, and they had the campaign manager had surveyed where they Bartlett family should have Thanksgiving, and nobody could quite figure out why this was a political thing. And I think that kind of goes to it, that we make things that really shouldn't be political randomly political, and things that maybe should be political, we kind of ignore the politics of it a
Yes.
little bit.
I think that's a great observation, which then leaves these PA practitioners stuck in this weird place of having to tell people that, yeah, science does show that, you know, the ocean is rising, or that people should wear masks, that's how, that's not a political thing. That's a legitimate scientific thing. And let's get on to talking about other things that could be political, right?
Right. Well, maybe that goes back to, the journalism side and, even your book of needing to know how to actually be able to talk to people and relay, what's going on, the facts, the truth, and kind of ignore everything else a little bit, or being able to speak to a broad audience, even if you know they're going to fundamentally disagree with you.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the great challenges we have, right? Is trying to convince people sometimes that things are in their own best interest, that they really need to do things that are in their own best interest rather than be convinced that, it's not because some political talking head has told you that.
The last 4 years would have been really different, but that's a different conversation.
A whole different conversation. That would be probably even more fun, but Mm,
I do have a couple friends, well, former friends. When they all joined the Trump White House, everybody stopped talking to them.
uh,
Uh, from grad school when I was in London, and from when I worked on the Hill, who all went and worked for Trump. That could be an interesting conversation, but
yes, I'm sure
I'm
it
not sure I
really.
want to go back there. I'm also not sure I want to be that guy on the news who has that conversation, because I think that would be the instance.
You're right. I think that could be it. Well, and at the same time, right, that's part of the challenge is how do we promote civility in these conversations, right? Like, how has suddenly everything, and not with you, you do an excellent job at remaining civil, but that's become part of the challenge over just the last decade is people getting so turned off by your average person is so turned off because they feel like politics has become so uncivil, that how do we as government practitioners then rebuild that trust with people and somewhat distance ourselves from politicians who become polarizing or full of disinformation or ethically unsound. And I say that about a lot of them, not just one in particular. But how do we remain this legitimate functioning body when those folks are seen as the figureheads for us, right? And that's such a huge issue and challenge today.
Yeah, I mean, when I teach my budgeting class for MPA students, we spend probably half the time talking about how to talk and communicate about budgeting. The act of creating a budget's really not that hard. It's how to help everybody else understand what's going on.
Yeah.
I don't think we spend enough time talking about the communication side of things.
No, I think you're totally right. And that is one of the problems. We get in our bubbles and we're like, we know what we're doing. We know this is the right thing to do. And when we start telling people about it, it gets too complicated and makes our jobs harder. But that's why we go into this, because it's hard. And so we have to always remember that, which it, like you said, it's tough when you're trying to explain something that can be complicated, but it's important for people to know and understand.
Yeah, I don't think I realized exactly how hard it would be from the public administration perspective when I came into it. Uh, I just thought this is a fun area I can write on.
Yes, there's always new problems to address.
As soon as you solve one, there's 10 more lined up, and they
Mhm.
never go away.
Yeah, this is true. It's very exciting. We can always remain relevant. There's always some new crisis or issue.
Makes for a nice, easy way to develop a massive research agenda, even
That's
if you
true.
never actually get through all of it.
Which could be the challenge. It's too much to do.
So I do want to kind of take us back to a little bit about the challenges of public administration. You ran for and were successful at becoming the ASPA president a couple of years ago. What was it about wanting to take on that role that attracted you, and kind of what did you hope to accomplish as that? And what did you?
Sure. Well,
Yeah, we'll go with that.
okay, that's great. Great question. Well, um, I wouldn't. It's kind of interesting because I was more drafted into running for ASPA president and talked into it by several friends or past presidents, and I was felt very honored to be able to serve. So it wasn't like something I had always thought, oh, I've always dreamed of being ASPA president, but I really was committed to making sure we remain strong with our connection between academics and practitioners. because I do always worry about that, because it's very challenging for practitioners to be able to serve in leadership positions in ASPA, simply because generally when you have that type of job, it's not valued in the same way or financially supported in the same way as it is if you're an academic. A lot of the practitioner friends I've had in ASPA have generally been paying their own way for things, or because again, it's something extra they're doing for their own professional development. And so I felt like I still feel very committed to that, and also ensuring, well, ASPA remained a very welcoming place for people from everywhere, in here and other folks, other countries, and so forth. Of course, everything I thought about doing or talked about doing when I was running for ASPA became very different once I became president of ASPA in the midst of COVID, where the whole focus became, on financial sustainability and on putting on a virtual conference, or the challenge of keeping people engaged during a time when we had to completely change the way we'd always done things. And there was this other challenge that I didn't really anticipate, but really was one of the greatest struggles I had, which is, what is ASPA's role in speaking? ASPA has always played an important role on speaking on behalf of its members and public service, but it's generally stayed out of politics. And I would say, with one exception, which is during the civil rights era, ASPA made some really important statements, supporting civil rights, which was seen as very political at the time. But during the past few years, a number of things came up in which we did take some stands that we lost some members over, but we also gained some members over. But we always did it with the idea that it was in the best interest, particularly at that time, of our colleagues who work in federal public service. And we would, and I'm not saying they're the most important, but they were the ones who were, I think, being harmed by some politics that were happening, and that we really had some good discussions about, this is the right thing to do, because we're an organization that's all about valuing and advancing excellence in public service. How we would be remiss if we didn't take a strong stand on some real, what we thought were detrimental things that were happening to public service. And so, that was a real interesting challenge that I think we had really good people helping navigate me on what to do about that. And that will continue to be a challenge as we go back to that conversation we just had about how so many things have become political when they really shouldn't be political. And how does an organization that represents people serving in public service, take a stand on those things without becoming embroiled in politics or being seen as political? There's also this challenge of ASPA remaining as who they've been, which is an umbrella organization where we can all get together, where it's academics and practitioners within multiple fields. And that's been a challenge, because what we've seen, as is, there's greater specialization now for both practitioners and academics. And there's all kinds of other organizations that people can attend and be involved with that are much more directed at their either work area or research interests. And so some people have pushed and said, gee, ASPA needs to specialize more. We can't be everything to everyone. But I think that's really what makes ASPA unique. And that's what I really like about ASPA. And that, we are always challenged with, how can we still serve everyone and do it well? How do we keep our conference is a nice blend. Our membership is a real nice balance of academics and practitioners. Our conferences don't always look like that. And that's because there can often be criticisms that they're very academic. But again, that gets back to the fact that, we are serving the academics very well, I think, in that way, in the sense that we let them, we as academics have to present papers and share our research and get feedback. But trying to balance that with what practitioners need, and how we can have great engaging conversations over important topics where we can all learn, where we can teach practitioners about what we're finding in research, and where practitioners can teach us what our research means to them in the field, and where people from different fields can come together. So, the budgeting and finance folks might not get the same in-depth budgeting and finance discussions, but we can also have conversations then with HR people and local government people and so forth. And so it's a real challenge on how we sustain that, I think. And the other big challenge we are facing is how do we remain affordable and accessible, especially to practitioners and members from the global south, and at the same time remain financially sustainable as an organization. Because we're not an organization that has a lot of very rich people who are willing to write checks and underwrite these things. We're an organization of public servants and academics who can barely afford to bring ourselves there. And so how, do we keep that? And our staff, I think, has done a great job at thinking through a lot of that. But those are, I think, some of the challenges we'll continue to face.
I'm thinking of, you're talking about the budget and finance and side of being at the conference. I actually generally don't go to the budget and finance panels when I'm at ASPA, and it's not that I don't like them. It's stuff that I've probably either heard at a different conference or people I know.
That's
So I go to all the other panels because I'm interested in finding something completely
yeah,
new that's
that's
outside of my typical.
so interesting you say that, because that's exactly, I think, what I do as well is like, oh, I'm kind of interested in this topic and I don't know anything about it. So I think I'll go hear that. And and we in the past, and it wasn't as much, but we tried to really strongly integrate both practitioners and academics on panels, which can be challenging. And and it can be easier when you have an in-person conference and rely on local practitioners, but in some ways this year was also an opportunity to do that with the virtual component, is to bring some people in who maybe otherwise couldn't have attended. But I think you're right. I think that's a great point. And that's how things, like this book I mentioned earlier, all of us who worked on this book do our core research in different areas or different fields. And we met at a conference, and that, it was like our side conversation that led us down this path. And I think that plays such an important role in, bringing different people doing different things together.
I mean, that is the thing that I've missed about conferences over the last year and few months is the random conversations. Yeah, you can hop on Zoom for a conference. It's not the same.
No,
Uh,
it's not. It is definitely not the same, right? Yeah, I think some of all the great career advice or the great research ideas I've had have come from sort of side conversations at conferences or meetings that weren't anticipated.
maybe one day.
That's right.
Fingers
Maybe
crossed one day.
soon.
Someone was talking the other day about how this is great. We can just keep having all these conferences by Zoom and has so much better engagement. And I was like, please don't. Whatever we do, don't do
No,
that.
right. I mean, ASPA is totally on, planning and moving forward with being in person in Jacksonville next spring. So fingers crossed.
See, that I'm hoping for, one, because I like Jacksonville, but also I plan on renting a place in Ferdinando Beach, just north of Jacksonville, for a
Oh,
few days afterwards.
that's a great plan. I know. You know what? I think that's a brilliant idea, Bruce.
I mean, we could rent like a nice large house that has like 5 or 6 rooms. You fill it up with a whole bunch of different people from the
Yeah.
conference.
And then you
It'll be
spend a
great.
couple days downloading everything, all those great ideas you got from the conference about things you want to do, right? That immediately get sucked away when you get back to your job.
Exactly. I mean, we could have JP host that somehow, I'm
That's a
sure.
great idea. I'm
We'll
sure
get Will
you
on it.
could get on that.
So we're getting close to the end. One thing I do want to ask right before we get off, though, if I know a lot of people when they look at ASPA, it's a large organization, has a lot of people who've been involved with for a really long time. If a early career scholar was interested in getting or wanted to get engaged with the association, what would you tell them or what advice would you give them or how would you push them?
Sure. There's the one thing that I always really, I had been involved in multiple other academic organizations, and ASPA I've always felt like has been my home. And part of it is because of the accessibility and the acceptance of, I think, all kinds of people. Meaning, you're not looked down upon based on what your research is, or that there's a real interest in particularly younger people, new professionals, that people, and I think ASPA really embrace all types of people and backgrounds coming. And I don't mean, I don't just mean like where you're from or what language you speak. I mean more of your academic discipline, or if you're a practitioner, that we have,
Right.
police officers and full professors who are at Research One sitting in the same room. And I think that, that there's just an environment of greater acceptance, that when you present research at ASPA, that people tend to be kind in their feedback and nurturing and supportive. So one, I would say it's really a great place in general to get good mentoring and make good connections of people who are really interested in your development. The other thing I'd say is ASPA does have a lot of good regional opportunities. You mentioned Socopa. Socopa is like my home in ASPA that I love. Like that is the first conference I ever went to that I truly felt like engaged and accepted, and saw a bunch of other people there like me, and connected with people, and I had been to a couple national conferences before that, but they can be big and overwhelming, and it can be hard to meet people. So going somewhere like Socopa or Nacopa, or I apologize, there's one in the Midwest that's great.
Impact.
Impact. Thank you. I was like, I know the name. And California has there's a number. And again, so I'm sorry, I don't really have a Southeast bias. I just have greater understanding of the Southeast. But some of the bigger states like Texas and California and Florida have state meetings, or state conferences, I should say, that are really great to go to get to know people at a more local and regional way. Of course, joining your ASPA chapter, and that is actually where I started. And why I ended up going to a Socopa is I was very active in my local ASPA chapter. Unfortunately, I would say most people don't live right near an ASPA chapter. So it can be a little more challenging, which maybe is one of the good things about the virtual year is we have seen chapter membership, or I should say participation, expand because, if you live in a state where there's one chapter and you live 3 hours away, you could suddenly engage with people because of the virtual meeting. So one, I would just say, look and see what's around you locally or regionally, like whether it's a chapter or a conference, and try to get engaged there, that people really want you to be a member of ASPA. It's not a elite club. It's really a place that cares about public service, and where that's what the focus is. And that people really want to welcome younger people into the field. And I think I had somebody say that it's interesting about my election into ASPA is somebody who I've known for a long time in the field, who's more of a practitioner, had said, I was really excited when you got elected to the ASPA president, because I mean, the two people I was running against are really great people, and they're much, I would say, stronger professionals or academics in a lot of ways, and where they are, where they've spent their career and what they've done, and they've got incredible publications, and they're really, again, both great people. But this person said, I liked that you were elected because I see you at all of, like, you have worked for ASPA and you are about service to the organization and the field. And that is what, it wasn't my name or my prestigious institution that got me elected. It was my network of people who I know in the organization. And I can sit and I think of them as friends, not this, professional network of people who are going to advance me. But I think that's one of the great things about ASPA is its accessibility to people and its interest in everyone, and seeing all voices, I think, to some degree is equal. And so I encourage people to find out who their council member is and contact them, because they do want to hear from you. If you want to serve on a committee, tell people, because we're always looking for people to do that. And that's how a lot of appointments I made, where it was just people I didn't even know reaching out to me. And I said, you know what, let's get them engaged. So there's lots of opportunities to serve if you just do a little bit of reaching out. I should add, getting to know the ASPA staff is also a real joy. And they're a tremendous resource to people, particularly newer members. And so if you don't know any of the folks who are, serving in your area, or you have trouble reaching people, reach out to the ASPA staff and they will definitely help you find ways to get engaged with ASPA. Sorry.
Perfect.
I'm
Well, I
sorry,
want to.
Bruce. Feel free to edit the hell out of this because I know I went on a lot longer than we had talked about.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time and talking with me today.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me.